without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Emma Jeffrey with her presentation Nightfalling, Dancing in the Dark as an Artistic Practice.
Thank you. I'll just go straight in. So this is a presentation in 3 parts. So part 1. In August 2011, I moved to Helsinki in Finland to begin my MA studies in live art and performance studies. For 2 years, I lived in Kumpula, which is a small town on the outskirts of Helsinki, which is surrounded by pine woodland. During my first winter there, I began walking through the woodland at night. Following the meandering pathways that circled through the trees became a way of passing the night's many sleepless hours. As I walked, I observed how the night's darkness shifted with the seasons, how the woodland's deep dark of late autumn could be transformed within hours by a heavy snowfall that illuminated the paths and set the whole woodland aglow. The snow transformed not just the landscape, but my movement within it. My walk shifted from what was a quiet, private stroll into a repetitive, crunching tread, each step announcing my presence in that place and forming a soundscape to my walks that would last until late spring. And then summer nights. Nights that were, in fact, not night at all, but instead a long turquoise twilight that made my walks in the early hours feel to be a slipway between the after dusk and almost dawn. Only occasionally would I catch sight or sound of someone else in the distance, and one or both of us would take another path, keen to sustain the solitude that had been so carefully cultivated by the night hours. Kumpula's nights were different to any I had known in England. They were different in depth, in quality. Kumpula is 7 degrees further north than where I grew up in North Yorkshire, England, where the landscape of agricultural farming means skies are vast, open, and with an earth-carved horizon. I did not know then, as a child, how lucky I was to know night as darkness, to know night to be a spectrum of blues and greys, shaped by the weather, seasons, and land. I was lucky to know what night felt like and to feel the exhilaration of being out at night, an exhilaration characterized as much by fear as it was by freedom. As an adult, those 2 years I spent night walking in Finland reminded me of what it was to be out in the night's dark and what it was to be immersed in the transitory, gradual process of its darkening. When I eventually left Finland and returned to London in 2013, I returned to the orange hues of city nights, to a starless stasis that stretched across Deptford's High Street and endured the year through. For 2 years, I continued to walk in London at night. Like London's other night walkers, I moved always with a sense of purpose and direction, even if, in truth, I had neither. I missed the freedom to meander, and to meander unseen. In walking at night, I began to reflect on how differently I moved through these landscapes and how differently these nightscapes moved through me. In moving to London from Kumpula, I felt the loss of the night's dark and the varied spectrum of its processual darkening. I began to read articles that used data and measurements to address the increasing spread of light pollution across the surface of the Earth, describing in numbers and figures the not so gradual diminishment of natural darkness. Yet these did not articulate the particular experiences of moving and encountering that I had of nighttime, experiences that I felt to be reliant on the dark and diminishing with the dark. Experiences that I felt could not be adequately articulated through words, but which needed to be comprehended as and through movement. In commencing my PhD research, I chose not to remain with the receding dark of cityscapes, but instead to seek out the potential ways of moving that were made possible by night's darkness. I wanted to work towards an understanding of moving with night, a practice of moving with night that did not simply rely upon darkness, but insisted upon its necessity. Part 2. So the conversation around night, why it is so important, and why darkness is worth conserving, tends to focus on 2 things. On the one hand, the conservation of nocturnal species, and on the other, stargazing and the visibility of the universe beyond our planet. These are both essential and magical aspects of our night world, and my own research engages to varying extents with both of them. However, as I've described in part 1, what I'm interested in is how we encounter the night world, how nighttime darkness shapes the ways in which we move and the ways in which we kinesthetically relate to a place at nighttime. So this interest in moving through nighttime places formed the basis of my PhD research at Lancaster University. Working in just one site, a place called Grubbins Wood, which is on the edge of the Lake District up north in Cumbria, my research took place specifically at nightfall, so those hours of processual darkening that are at once almost night and also not yet night. My research involved a series of workshops, one for local participants and another for professional dancers. And it generated 2 nighttime choreographies that took place over the duration of nightfall. This image and some of the others in this presentation are taken from one of those choreographic works performed in 2019, so a while back now, 3 years ago, called On the Patterns We Gaze. And I'll be showing a short film of that work in part 3 at the end. So in this section, instead of giving an overview of my whole practice, I'm just going to share one strand of it. So I'd like to start by saying that as a dancer, before I began dancing in the dark in the wood, I believed that the skills I had acquired through training, the ways of moving that I had learned as a dancer, I believed that they belonged to me, that I held that knowledge in my body to be executed at will. It wasn't until I began working in the wood that I began to recognize that my way of dancing was entirely facilitated by the spaces in which I danced and by the similarities of those spaces, by their flat floors, the warm temperature, the consistent level of light. I began to realize that my dancing didn't exist in the space, but rather only ever existed with and through the space. When I first started dancing in Grubbins Wood in the dark, I had to learn to listen, not simply with my ears, but to listen kinesthetically, to listen through my movement in a way I don't think I had ever really had to do before. Movement became an additional sense, an alternative way of understanding the night world of the wood. Having been accustomed to moving in indoor studio spaces, where the only real element of change is the movement of humans, of myself and other dancers, then dancing in the wood meant not only attuning to the motions and surfaces of other than human beings, but also to how the weather, seasons, and changing level of darkness constantly altered the environment and the inhabitants that comprised that environment. Perhaps the most significant of these alterations was my relationship to the ground. As a dancer, even when you dance alone, you are really always duetting with the ground, with the surface of the earth and the invisible ties of gravity that exist between you. In the wood, the ground is an undulating and folding surface, a living space that sinks and rises, one that is made up of both the burrowing roots of trees and the flourishing stems of saplings. So whereas the surface of a studio floor enables the dancer to find, lose, and then re-find a sense of stability, the woodland floor at night seemed to create a constant unbalancing. In the dark, the feet sort of seek and discover what the eyes cannot. At nightfall, the ground seemed to determine my movement in such a way that felt that rather than dancing on it, it was moving me and moving through me. Another way of saying that is that rather than my body being in motion across the ground was in motion through my body. To explore this sensation further, I began by simply walking through the wood. And as I walked, I held pencil to paper, allowing the alterations and transfer of weight between my feet to feed upwards through my body, so that what appeared on paper are tracings of how the crinkling of the wood's ground is felt at night through motion. Of course, the hand isn't really tracing the tread of the foot, that sort of alternating rhythm, but rather the flow of the motion, a flow which is determined by the relationship between the weight of the body and the texture of the ground. When we walk through woodland in the daytime, we can see the impression our bodies make on the ground. We leave footprints, we make pathways through our tread. We can see very readily the impact of our presence and those that were present before us. What we don't so easily see is how the ground makes its impressions on us. But when we walk in the dark, the ground makes itself felt. During this simple practice, the increasing darkness of the wood seemed to facilitate and perhaps even ask for a transition of walking into wandering. Of course, this wandering, this sort of slow meandering, is not how we usually negotiate space. For instance, how we move from place to place in urban areas tends to be very different. The brightly lit and direct pathways of urban spaces enables an efficiency to movement. It gives us choice, which in turn enables speed. But this slowing, wandering, that the dark doesn't simply allow for, but requires, is a way of encountering the world that few of us have access to in our everyday lives. For me, it's not simply that the dark requires us to slow down, that it makes it possible for us to meander, to move aimlessly, to get lost, but also that, as I described earlier, it allows us to follow the ground, to experience ourselves not as individual units that tread upon the surface of the earth, but rather that we are moved by and with the environment of which we are a part. In the dark, the undulations of the wood's ground felt, for me, like little nudges away from a vertical, stable stance. And I think this constant unbalancing that both myself and a lot of the workshop participants commented upon experiencing, I think it acts as a sort of metaphor for what night's darkness can bring. That loss of stability, of verticality, of certainty in where my movement ends and the environment begins. It feels like the night's darkness has the capacity to shift humans sideways, to dismantle any sense of hierarchy that we might have built up between ourselves and the rest of the world. As theorist Jane Bennett, the author of Vibrant Matter, suggests, and I quote, "To begin to experience the relationship between persons and other materialities more horizontally is to take a step towards a more ecological sensibility." Moving in the dark, then, makes felt not only how entangled we are in the world, but also how dependent we are. To move in the dark is to be humbled by the dark. Whilst engaging with this practice over the course of nightfall, the shapes and forms of the things I see gradually blur and merge into one another, becoming something other, something unfamiliar. However, in the dark, whilst my vision loses the clarity of distinct form, it instead perceives the potential existence of a relatedness between things, a relatedness that is entangled, seeping, and shifting. In this way, human eyes that open to the night do not see less of the world, but more of it. They see the potential for things, bodies, and surfaces to exist beyond the parameters of their form, to be more than what they seem. As dance scholar Bojana Šežić asserts, the shadow is also another body. As much as night's darkness engenders a shift in my visual perception, so too does it engender a shift in my kinesthetic perception. Just as seeing in the dark reveals the ways in which forms blur, merge, smudge, and become with one another, dancing in the dark makes tangible the ways in which movement spills beyond form, existing always between and beyond material structure. In each nightly return to the wood, in each movement repatterned by darkness, there exists a folding over of relations, one that seeps and sifts, not just with the immediate darkening environment of the wood, but also with each shadow body of the night before, the season before, the year before. To summarize, when I dance, I have an understanding of myself as a body in motion. And by that, I mean as a form that is capable of mobility and articulation. However, when I dance in and with night's darkness, I have an understanding of myself as a body in motion, a body immersed within motion, within the motion of the sight, within the motion that is nightfall itself. Part 3, and I can give those references again if anyone needs them. So I'm just going to show a short film of one of the pieces I made called On the Patterns We Gaze. The whole piece itself, it lasted for the duration of nightfall, so it's about an hour and a half long. The film is 9 minutes. The piece was made up of 3 solos, and the last solo doesn't really feature on the film because it was at a level of darkness that we just couldn't pick up with technology without using artificial lighting or something. So that's not really there so much. And then the last thing to say about, well, there's a lot to say about the work, but the last thing that I'd like to say is that there were 4 performances of the work, but we only invited an audience to 2 of them, and the other 2 were for the wood, because that whole practice of moving with and for the more than human had been such a huge part of the work. So in a way, it was more of a circular practice, an event that took place nightly, and yeah, human audience were just there for half of that. I will now show the film, technology permitting. Thanks.
I think we've got maybe 2 or 3 minutes, just if there are any questions or responses. I think we have to stick to the scheduling still, just because of the people that are linking in and trying to do different things at different times, if that makes sense. So we've been taught to stick to it as much as we can. My assumption is that more for that, and so how you describe that experience of blurring edges during dance, where the light affected that.
Yeah, so actually the white was to, in a way, it prolonged the blurring, because in dark or ordinary clothes, they were lost from sight very quickly. So actually the white, in the beginning they looked very stark, but actually it was to prolong the visibility, particularly in the far distance, and to prolong that blurring. And also, I really enjoyed, I don't know if they enjoyed it, the 3 of them, they were amazing. The weather was, you know, this was springtime, but they got absolutely coated in mud every time. And I actually really enjoyed that dampening of the visible coating as well. So that can help make it more clear. Yeah, but thanks.
In language, in English, like dark and light, there are loads of fine. So, and that, you know, goes on into racialized negatives and all sorts of things. I wonder if this process changed your approach to the relationship.
Yeah, I think that I think it's a huge, huge area of research. It's one that I touched on a little bit in the PhD, but I did feel like maybe as a white person, I wasn't sure. I didn't want to appropriate any conversation around that, but I do feel like it's one that needs to be had about how we value whiteness and lightness compared to darkness and blackness. And
around fear, that's around fear.
Yeah. Yeah.
And white, racialized the power. What about fear? Did it change
I guess in a way, I mean, at the very beginning, my choice to work in a non-urban space was maybe motivated by the fact that when I was in London and night walking, and I sort of said at the beginning, I felt I had to move, I had to look like I had somewhere to go, because there were times when I didn't quite feel safe, and I knew that I was very visible, and I was visible as a woman. But when I was in very dark spaces, I actually felt much more freedom, because then I was just a sound and an unknown amongst other sounds and unknowns, and that was quite freeing. So that was definitely a choice to actually go to the dark for feeling a bit safer, I guess. But yeah, definitely. And a lot of what was interesting was that it's a whole different issue, but a lot of the participants that joined in, a lot of them were female, and a lot of them wanted, identified as female, and they spoke about that, the freedom to be within a group and to feel safe within a group, but to have a feeling of experiencing the dark alone, that that was quite unique for them, and to feel safe in that. So that was nice. Yeah, another topic of research to do. Yeah.
My apologies, we are going to need.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Perfect. All right. So welcome everybody to our next presentation. So very happy to welcome Sam Hodge, who's going to introduce Cold Tides.
Thank you. So, hi everybody. If you want to move a bit closer, please do, because it's not a great huge screen. So feel free to move the chairs a bit closer.
Would you like one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's shunt a little bit closer. Yes.
So I'm a visual artist working with paint and printmaking processes. I'm not a dancer or a performance artist, but I do consider my work to be a type of contact improvisation between me and the materials. The intimate reciprocal relationship as I respond to the activity of the materials and they respond to mine is what generates the artwork. Making my own pigments from found things, which I started to do relatively recently, has extended my interaction to the environment around me. And in this presentation, I will be talking particularly about a group of works made with coal picked up on the Thames shore. You can see them. First, I'm going to say a bit about myself and how I started making this type of work. I originally studied natural sciences and then trained and worked as a painting conservator before starting to play seriously at making my own artwork about 14 years ago. I now have a studio at Chisenhale Art Place in London and do my printmaking at East London Printmakers. And my background in science and conservation has given me an abiding fascination with the agency and power of materials, how they interact with each other and transform over time, creating, disintegrating, creating. At the same time, I'm interested in our human entanglement with the material world, how we respond to it and its shifting and unstable nature, attempting to control, collect, and make sense of it. There are two strands to my work, one where I encourage the materials to transform and create forms that I then respond to, and another where I collect and record discarded or damaged human-made objects that have already been metamorphosed into ambiguous and animated forms. In both of these, I'm looking out for what Jane Bennett, who seems to have got a name check in every talk so far, calls thing power. So yeah, thing power, I like thing power. This is a photopolymer etching of a piece of beach plastic picked up on one of my coast walks, part of a discarded water bottle transformed by the tides into a new type of sea creature. I was born and brought up on the Kent coast, and the area where the land and sea meet is a fruitful source of inspiration and found objects for me, a place constantly in flux, changing from tide to tide and shifting over years. It is a place where human efforts to build, control, and defend are very evident, but also the power of water and weather to transform. So a lot of my early work was landscape painting, but then I had a bit of an epiphany when I realized I was bored with my own mark making. My gestures with the brush always seemed to be too much of me, too predictable, even when I was trying to be free and expressive. I realized I wanted to let the materials do more of the work because they have the capacity to surprise and delight me. So to make this painting, I poured dilute grey paint onto a canvas which was laid flat on the floor, and then tipped it up just enough so that the diluent ran out of the paint, taking away some of the pigment and eroding these lines, which revealed the pale light priming underneath. So this pattern of lines that emerge creates a paintscape, evoking other types and scales of landscape. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Okay. No. Nature calls these patterns viscous maculae. They are release patterns made by squashing and pulling apart paint medium between two smooth, hard sheets. And they could be metal etching plates, as in this case, or perspex or glass. And I love the way that such an organic looking branching pattern of this complexity can emerge from simple physical forces. For me, this is an illustration of the blurry boundary between life and matter. All living things are built of matter, and so will fundamental properties. And this pattern is one of the ways that matter likes to arrange itself, whether it is the veins in a human body, tree roots, or a river delta. But I also feel strongly that matter, even when it's not alive, is active and creative, not just a load of passive, inanimate stuff waiting for things to be done to it. And so this is the reason that I try not to use the word use in relation to skills, but I prefer to say making with. So I don't regard paintings as static, passive objects either, but recognize from my experience as a painting conservator that they continue to change throughout their lifetimes. And in some of my work, I've begun to explore and encourage these changes. For example, in this painting, a macula made with iron powder was exposed to moisture so that it began to rust. And in this painting, there are a mixture of fugitive pigments that will fade quickly in light and more stable pigments, so that some of these cells will change color, some stay the same, and some fade away completely. And this is an installation that you can walk in and through that's displayed in total darkness. It's made with luminescent pigments that absorb the energy from light and then emit their own glow when displayed in the dark. In 2019, during a residency on the Greek island of Symi, I began to make my own pigments and inks from found materials such as earth, plants, and the detritus left by human activity. This was a revelation for me. I began to be interested in the life of my materials before they got to me and became part of the artwork. I began to ask questions about what they were made of and how they got there and what they could do, which connected me immediately to the geological, biological, and human stories embodied in the landscape. So I began to learn the alchemy of making color from place, and I immediately found it satisfying. I learned how to identify many local plants and how to grind up earth pigments and boil bark and leaves to make ink. It connected me to the landscape in a sensual way. I learned the feel of things, the weight and texture. and the smell that each had. And I was delighted at their transformations into coloured matter, doing things on paper. So while I was in Simi, I made work from stuff as various as squid ink, red and yellow earth, burnt goat bones, holm oak acorn caps, wild sage leaves, eucalyptus bark, rusty objects abandoned in the boatyard, soot from a monastery cheese-making oven, and copper wiring found next to a gun emplacement on the town beach. It meant that both my pleasure in walking and my general tendency to stop and touch things and pick them up suddenly had a new purpose. And I also began to try and answer some of those questions about what I was finding. So, for example, I learned from Ruth Siddall, the geologist and pigment expert at the Slade, a bit about the way Mediterranean red earths, or terra rossa, are formed, and about how they're being eroded away due to deforestation. And so my paint now had a meaning personal to me, but also related to that particular place. And there are an increasing number of individuals making their own materials from what they find. And I was inspired to do this by Jason Logan, author of Make Ink, who is based in Toronto and who I've been following on Instagram, and by my friend and artist Tessa Grundon from New York. And I'm now find myself part of a worldwide movement of artists like Pete Ward, who was supposed to be speaking next. I'm very sad that he's not, because I was looking forward to meeting him, who are sharing their knowledge of pigment sources and ways of working with them, relearning traditional ways of making, which some societies and individuals have kept alive and continue to practice, and trying out new ways of physically engaging with what is around them and making something out of it. So when I came back to Britain, I began to make colour out of place here too. This painting is made with things I found in the Lake District, which I think you can see. And I also started collecting ochres and chalk from eroded cliffs on my coastal walks. But then COVID intervened, and for a while I was limited to making paint with things found in my own home. And but then, when it eased partially, I started walking the edge of England closest to my house in East London, and that is the Thames shore. So this is a view from Deptford down the steps to Deptford Beach, what is called Deptford Beach. The Thames has a large tidal reach, and in many places, small beaches appear at low tide, some of them accessible by steps. Being down on the Thames foreshore, she gives you a very different perspective from the streets above. It is a very liminal space, appearing briefly, and always soon to be covered again with brown water rushing away over your head level. These high walls were built in the 19th century to contain and control the river, pen it into a narrower space, but they do not take away its raw power. It can be dangerous, and it is possible to get cut off by the tide easily. So this is a view of the city from Limehouse. There's a constant collision of old and new and many different timescales at work. Also at Limehouse, but looking back at the wall. So I share the space on the shore with the occasional mudlarker searching for treasure under the rainbow, and sometimes human and sometimes not human. The anoxic Thames mud, which is so good at preserving organic material, has a particular and not very pleasant smell that lingers on your hands, even when you've washed them. Even though the river has a more than human power, the majority, in fact, the vast majority of stuff on the shore has come to be there through human activity over the last 2 millennia. Piles of debris dumped there under the mistaken impression that it was away, or dropped and lost by accident, or from structures left to disintegrate, have been washed up and down and weathered by the river. Structures, human-made things and structures have now become an important part of most landscapes and ecologies, nowhere more so than the Thames, where human entanglement with the more than human is wonderfully exhibited. I enjoy the prospect of making colour out of these things, kind of human-made and transformed things in some ways more than purely natural materials. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a few slides showing how the river gathers and sorts these objects, grouping things of a similar size and type and weight together. So this is, here it's mostly bricks washed into round pebbles, which are called spuds. Here the river has gathered together ceramics, bits of old roof tile, fragments of pot, clay pipe stems. Some parts of the shore will be covered in metal objects like these nails from boats or wooden jetties. My favorite is the animal bones and coal, which cluster together with the old leather shoe soles, all obviously of a similar weight and buoyancy. So this is my attempt to further sort some of the things I found on the river. These are all finds from one mudlarking trip down to the Thames shore at Deptford, which I did with a group of artists called Ground Collective, who are doing a residency at APT Gallery in Deptford. We brought stuff that we had found in the local area back to the gallery and made work there together. One of my fellow artists, Mark Soden, is a really serious mudlarker and was fortunately able to tell me a lot about what I'd found, which otherwise I wouldn't have known. And so much of London's history is here. There's evidence of the sugar and tobacco trades that poured wealth into London from slave plantation. So, for example, here, there are pieces of sugar mold pots for making sugar. And there's a bit of old pipe, 18th century pipe. The sugar mold pots are from the 17th century. Then there's chalk at the bottom that was shipped in to provide foundation for jetties. There are bricks and tiles, pieces of pot dating back to Roman times and up to the present day, bones of animals that were eaten, but also used as the main means of transport over hundreds of years. Hobnailed boot soles, lots of wire and metal rope and that kind of thing. Many of these things can make pigments, but the one that most appealed to me, it kind of spoke to me, was the coal. I liked its blackness and smoothness with touches of crystalline glitter. It's quite light, unlike the black flint pebbles that it resembles, and quite warm to the touch. I've got some with me if anybody wants to come and feel it later. So coal was being shipped from Newcastle to London in large quantities by the 16th century. It fueled the city, making it the first city in the world to be dependent on a fossil fuel, powered the industries, heated the homes of London, and blackened the buildings and lungs of its inhabitants until the second half of the 20th century. Slipping and dropped while being unloaded from ship to dock, some of the coal ended up in the river. It was then washed up and down with the tide, smoothed into pebbles and sorted by the river into these dark lines on the strand with the bones and the shoe soles. So this photo was taken in an area of the Thames right out in the estuary near Tilbury. It's the site of an old jetty where coal was delivered in huge quantities in the 19th century. And as the sea levels have risen recently and eroded away the banks of the river, you can see a line of coal forming a new Anthropocene geology. And here's Tate Modern, old Bankside power station, which was originally built as a coal-fired power station in 1891. So it belched out smoke and grit over the whole area, including St Paul's on the opposite side of the Thames, contributing to the infamous London smogs. And here you can see still washing up and down is coal, some of which I think might have been on its way to the power station. Oops, I don't want that. How do I go on to the next one? There we are. So I began grinding coal into pigment during the Ground Collective residency at APT Gallery. And of all the things I could have chosen from that table of mudlarking finds, the coal was perhaps the hardest to make into a pigment. So First, I have to smash it with a hammer. And so this is quite a violent act, as well as kind of, it's not a sort of gentle intervention. Had enough of that, short of time. So next one. So after crush, then I have to grind it further in a pestle and mortar. Smashing and grinding the coal into pigment is slow and full of the friction of a direct encounter with hard rock. Its time compressed deep underground has hardened the coal. It's not as hard as diamonds, but it's not as soft and easy to grind as charcoal. Working like this reminds me of the hard labour of the people who dug, carried and breathed this coal. This process takes ages, but it can be quite meditative as well as hard work. The slowness gives me time to think about the deep time through which the coal was made from remnants of carboniferous forests, and its more recent journey to meet me on the Thames shore and my journey to meet it. So after crushing in the pestle and mortar, the coal dust is still quite coarse. So I have to sieve it and then grind it further with water on an etched glass slab. I can hear and feel the point in the grinding when it becomes smoother. And then I push it to the side of the slab to dry and store it as a dry pigment powder. To make it into paint, I mix it with a medium, usually gum arabic, but I've also been experimenting with casein and gel from seaweed, less successfully. So this is a video of me making one of the artworks you can see outside. I pour water from the Thames, actually, so onto paper and then put the coal paint into it. Now, at this point, I think I've decided it doesn't have enough ink in it, enough of the paint. So I'd go and tip a bit more in.
Yeah.
So this video was taken by my fellow artist, Madhya Acharya Baskerville at the residency. And when I saw it, I realized there was a performative element to my painting practice. And I'd always thought of it like a dance with the materials. And I often play music in my studio when I'm making this sort of painting, but making the work during a group residency with other artists and other people around made the performative element much more obvious. And I subsequently found out about contact improvisation and realized that my way of working has some similarities with this type of dance performance. I regard the coal, water, and paper as active participants. They respond to my touch and actions and to each other, and I respond to what they do. So the painting takes about 2 days to dry, sometimes longer if it's cold or a bit quicker if it's warm. This is after it had dried. So watching paint dry is one of my favorite things to do. So I'm going to play you a quick video of time-lapse video of paint drying. So as the paper swells with the moisture and buckles, the water then responds to the paper and flows into the valleys, taking most of the coal paint with it. Then as the water evaporates from the tops of the paper hills, it draws the paint up by capillary action, producing tide lines. The coal is not a pure pigment, so it separates into different fractions. The browner, more soluble part of it moves more quickly, and the heavier grey-black particles settle in the dips. One of the things I like about working with pigments and inks I've made myself is that their impurities make them behave in more interesting and unpredictable ways than manufactured pigments. Commercial pigments have been chosen and refined for consistency in order to make them easier to control, but I want my pigments to surprise me. So I also work with the coal pigment to create dendritic release patterns like the ones I showed you earlier. And you can see detail of that last painting. You can see the little crystalline coal bits on top of the paint there. And then I also combine the two types of work into collages, trying out different combinations until they seem in some way right to me. That's one of the little collages I made, and they're quite biomorphic forms, which people do have a tendency to read lots of things into, which I like. I think that's kind of fine. And I hope that you will go and see some of them on display at the garden room if you haven't already seen them, and see what you make of them. So I hope there is some time for questions, but one question I have for you first is that does the fact that I have a sensual, sometimes visceral contact with my materials and environment they come from make any difference to the effect the actual works have on you as a viewer? Do you have to see or know about me finding the coal, touching it, smashing it into a powder, doing a contact improvisation with the coals and the river water and paper in order to appreciate the result? Should the making be a public performance, or does the work on its own? Any questions? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so basically you just get a flat plate of something, let's say a piece of perspex, or glass, put some paint. I actually usually use acrylic because it's the best for this, but although I am trying to use more natural materials, but this is the one that works best. Put another sheet of perspex on top and you press until it squishes flat, and then you pull it apart and you get a pattern of ridges formed by the release of pressure, which I then take a print of. So sometimes I take a print of it, sometimes I use the actual three-dimensional thing in some way, like on the reverse of the perspex or something like that. But so that's how it's a purely physical process, and it's one that anyone can do. Children, I've done workshops with little children doing it, and it's incredibly straightforward process, but makes incredible, out of it emerge these really organic, complicated patterns. So.
I'm quite interested in the different knowledges that you bring to your work. So, I mean, you told us you had a scientific background, and occasionally that was really helpful where you said, like, I think I have a look at each of those things,
yeah.
And then you said, but then in that video where you're actually making the art,
yeah,
you were adding stuff. It looked random, and I just wonder where do you hold that knowledge of whether to add?
That's something that's is really, I don't think you hold it. It's like, that's why I think it's a bit like a performance, because it's something that just happens and you have to be completely in the moment and think, and you're not really thinking.
So is it
you're
like
just
a conversation?
yes, yeah. So yeah. So sorry, there's two people sitting one behind the other. So I'll go for the front person first.
Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's interesting because they look like calligraphy, but calligraphy is done in a very sort of flowing,
yeah.
process is very different to that. It's quite considered, and you are making aesthetic choices.
Yes, I'm making
stop.
Yeah.
And when to do.
Yeah, no, definitely. No, there's a lot of me in it still, but it's just more of a selecting.
Yeah.
And sort of enabling and selecting than it is a gestural mark making.
And I mean, it's kind of connected in the same when do you decide?
Yeah. So there are lots of decision. Yeah.
Too, so I kind of
yeah. So of course there are lots of decision making processes in it. It's not like I'm just letting the materials do everything. I mean, they wouldn't be there doing it without me. And obviously a lot of the things I do control what they do, but there's a kind of toing and froing between the materials and me. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And I think to go very briefly to your question that you asked us, I think scale to me makes a big difference. And when they're big, I relate them to you. So they're not I mean, when they're smaller,
yeah. Yes, no, that's interesting. Yes. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Works.
Thank you.
In answer to the question,
okay.
But I'm really curious. All the happening which the show is mostly made by water. The pigments are just carrying
yeah.
It's important. It's beautiful. How the river shapes these overcarries, you know, along the tide lines. And it's all choreographed.
Yeah.
I was wondering if the relation with water.
Yeah, well, yes, well, of course, yes, we all do for that reason. Yeah, yeah. So yes, I think, well, as I was saying, because I was brought up by the sea and kind of lived by the sea, I really have always felt that power of water and the way that it moves other things, and the edge of water, particularly the fact that it's going backwards and forwards, but also it's a kind of skin, a boundary. but also an invitation. So all of that kind of thing. So, but yeah, the power of water, amazing. Yeah.
I think we are going to have to.
Okay.
Sorry, we still just keep on going, but just appreciation for that. Wonderful.
Thank you.